something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Before the main discussion today, I want to thank all of our Patreon subscribers for their support. If it weren't for all of you, we would not be able to do this. If you are not a subscriber, you are missing out on hundreds of hours of content which illuminate the organized criminal entity that is the U.S. Empire. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. I am thrilled to be here today with Lawrence Wilkerson and Gary Vogler. Lawrence Wilkerson is a former U.S. Army colonel, now retired, and the former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell under George W. Bush's presidential administration. And I'm with Gary Vogler, who is a former retired oil executive and also the senior oil advisor to the occupation, the U.S. occupation following the Iraq War. He was the senior oil advisor to Jay Gardner and Paul Bremer. And it's an honor to be with you both, gentlemen.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, good to be with you, Aaron.
So today's question is that I wanted to focus on is something that a lot of people have been debating. And because the two of you have personal experience, I thought it would be illuminating to have a conversation with you about this. And the central issue is, first and foremost, what is the reason for the USA's fanatical and self-defeating, from an imperialist or foreign policy perspective or a realist perspective, the policies that we've had toward Israel? And this is something that it seems so. Is it the U.S. that controls Israel? Is it Israel that controls the U.S.? Is it something else? This is the core of it. And it seems like something that we take for granted if you've grown up, when I have in the 90s, 2000s, and 21st century, all that. But it wasn't. Israel isn't this ancient thing from the Old Testament. It was founded in 1948. It was contentious at the time. Harry Truman recognized Israel, and the same year he took a $2 million bribe or a campaign contribution from a wealthy Zionist, which some people think may have swung the election, the upset in 1948. And U.S. presidents sort of vacillated between having too much support for Israel or not. I think most remarkable, you had Eisenhower essentially throwing a monkey wrench into the plans for a greater Israel during the Suez Crisis. And you had Kennedy, who confronted Israel very decisively, or attempted to, and then died not that long afterwards. I think his assassination was overdetermined, but that was that. And then LBJ was extremely pro-Israel and essentially helped them in the Six-Day War to be able to be victorious and take a bunch of land in that war. Nixon sort of had a confused policy. Reagan and H.W. Bush at times stood up to Israel in key ways. I think most notably, Reagan pulls those Marines out of Lebanon in 1983. He also orders a stop to the bombings that were appearing on the nightly news of children being killed in Lebanon. Reagan also, at the very end of his presidency, recognized that the PLO, which the Zionists very much opposed, they wanted to insist that they were still terrorists. And in the next presidency of George H.W. Bush, you had very early on James Baker saying to a crowd of pro-Zionist people, it's time to put aside this greater Israel fantasy. It's unrealistic, and we need to move on for peace. And H.W. Bush threatened to cut off loan guarantees to Israel if they didn't enter into negotiations for a Palestinian state. It all falls apart under Bill Clinton, and he tilts toward Israel. And the next president, W. Bush, is the most pro-Israel president, since LBJ, at least, if not more so. And so this brings to mind this question of what is it that controls U.S. foreign policy? Who or what? Do American Zionists have so much influence in the U.S. that they control U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East? Or is it the U.S. that uses Israel to achieve otherwise unachievable policy goals in the Middle East? Or is it perhaps the outcome of political struggles between coalitions of powerful people, oligarchs, across political borders? What is it that we're looking at? You each have very unique backgrounds that give you insight into both of those Bush administrations, the one-term presidency of H.W. Bush and the two-term presidency of W. Bush. So I think I'd like to start by asking Larry to respond to this, maybe the bigger questions in a big way, who controls this policy? But if you could talk about your experience earlier on, before you were working under Colin Powell in the White House, what was your experience thinking about Israel during H.W. Bush's presidency, in particular? What in the Reagan and H.W. Bush years, how did you perceive this relationship and its influence on U.S. policy?
Well, one thing you left out about Reagan is he also sold, over great protests, F-15s and AWACS to Saudi Arabia. You got several days to listen to this. You gave a brief sketch of some of the things that have happened that seem inexplicable unless you subscribe to one theory or the other. Either the United States is using Israel or Israel is using the United States. There's another possibility, of course, that it vacillates between the two, depending on the geopolitical, geostrategic issue at hand. I'm one who thinks that now, today, forget the past. The past worked up to this from the point where in 1742, Napoleon, when he invaded Egypt, decided he was going to use the Jews to help him. We could go all the way back to that and how the great game has been played since then and how the Jews have woven themselves in and out of that game, both for their wealth and for their ability to fight, if you will. Napoleon's attempt, of course, failed catastrophically when Nelson defeated his fleet at the Nile and he had to retreat. But nonetheless, it started at least that early with regard to the modern age and people trying to use the Jews for this or that, and ultimately to use Israel. The reason I subscribe now to the much grander, if you will, and that's not a description of how sweet it is, it's global, is that the United States is failing. The American empire, established decisively in 1945, is failing. It's had its run. It doesn't have a future, an imperial entity. The people behind our presidents, the billionaires, the oligarchy, I don't call them the deep state anymore. They're just the moneyed bastards behind our presidents. And there are all kinds of people. There's over 118 of them, I found out the other day. And each of them has his own influence in his own niche. Charles Koch has huge influence over this administration even. And there are others too, Peter Thiel and a host of others. But what's happening is we're trying to arrest this deterioration. And it manifests itself most dramatically in the fact that the other power who is gaining the power we're losing is China, now allied with Russia and increasingly with India, which gives us a real pain in the rear end because that's almost half the world allied against us and fairly formidable half of the world when you consider China is the number one economy in the world right now. It is, without doubt. So how do you arrest that? Well, you create an arc of crisis all the way from the Arctic Ocean, which we're beavering away to start a fight with the Russians up there, all the way down to the Baltic, where we had a stupid, utterly stupid American general say he could do an airborne operation and take Kaliningrad in a matter of hours. He would be destroyed, utterly destroyed. Into the proxy war in Ukraine, into the attempts for proxy wars in Georgia, Azerbaijan, you name your place, into the big one, the huge one, the one that's going to come to fruition probably before Christmas, Iran. And all of that is designed to fight our deterioration and to do it through proxies. That's an important point, because we can't fight anymore unless it goes nuclear. We got plenty of nuclear weapons, thank you very much. But we do not have a military that's going out there and fight anybody and beat them. We've proven that in the last 20 years, and it's even worse now because our war reserve stocks are bottomed out. The largest one in Israel and others around the world are virtually bottomed out. That's the reason Hegseth has been giving some fairly acute advice to Trump about starting another war or about going further with Ukraine. What do you do if you're at that point? You don't want to go nuclear yet. And I say that with a footnote. You don't want to go nuclear yet. You want to use proxies. Where is your proxy for the southern part of this block? A very important part. Railroads from China now reach Iran. Where do you go? You go to Iran. You go to Israel. We're using Israel to clean up the Levant. Lindsey Graham is absolutely truthful in the Senate when he says, come on, people. If they weren't doing it, we'd have to be there doing it, meaning slaughtering the Palestinians and, taking territory in Syria and elsewhere. That's our goal. We're using Israel to do that, and we're holding our nose over what they're doing in Palestine. And recently, our fingers slipped off our nose a little bit, particularly with regard to what just happened in Gaza with the reporters and the medical personnel and others, because it's coming off. The masquerade, the mask, whatever, is coming apart. It's coming apart because they are perpetrating a genocide, a horrible genocide. And they're doing it in our name. They are doing it in our name. And I'm not so sure we can continue to do this and deny everything that's happening and come out of it smelling like the rose that Donald Trump wants to come out of it. He's certainly not going to come out of it with a Nobel Peace Prize, which is one of his great objectives. But it's a much bigger struggle than what we've cited for the past. Much bigger struggle. It's existential for the empire. And there are a lot of people behind this president who are waiting, Aaron. They have a decision to make. Do we do like a lot of really wealthy people did when Napoleon won or Wellington won at Waterloo against Napoleon? Do we jump ship? Do we trade flags? Do we move our money into different banks? Do we back another power? Or do we go down with the sinking ship? They've got to make this decision. As I said, there are over 100 billionaires in this country who in one way or another are contemplating that decision. Some of them have already relocated dual citizen, triple citizen to Germany, to Switzerland, because they're positioning themselves to go either way, if you will. But that's what we're doing. And the critical point right now is not Ukraine. It could be at any moment, but Ukraine, I think, has passed its criticality. We're down there in a place where we're going to start a war against Iran through Netanyahu, and we're both going to lose.
Did you see that they announced plans to pull out more troops and evacuate some of the big bases in Iraq? Because this is it's scheduled for mid-September to basically be, I think, well along the way or maybe completed. But
yeah, well, Trump said he wants to, and we've been ordered out, finally.
So the other part that I wanted to ask you about this, just and you don't need to necessarily give a detailed answer, but perhaps your general sense of what was it like in those last administrations that seemed to be more willing to confront Israel, which was Reagan's. I mean, paradoxically, because we associate these with the beginning of the high tide of U.S. imperialism, after Vietnam, is the Reagan Revolution, so-called. But
well, that's an easy answer. The Cold War was still going on,
right?
And we needed Israel. We needed Israel from the perspective of fighting the Soviets, which is a very different perspective than fighting to preserve our empire. Very different conflict. Very different conflict. The other one was in stasis, a manageable stasis. And so you just didn't want to lose people like Israel. You didn't want people peeling off and going to the other side or becoming neutral. So the stasis helped. It kept things stable for half a century. All of a sudden, when that comes off and you realize very quickly, not as quickly as you should have, but you realize fairly quickly that you're going down, you get panicky and you do all manner of stupid things. Like, for example, go to Kaliningrad and say you can take it in a minute. That's the start of a nuclear war. No question about it. Putin would not tolerate that at all. It'd be a war between NATO and Russia under the old aegis, and our nuclear umbrella and Article 5 would be right there. So it's become, in some respects, insane on our side, and it's made doubly insane by the fact we have an absolutely incompetent man at the top of this, and he picked a roughly incompetent cabinet to help him.
Right. It definitely seems that the initiative for whatever is happening doesn't come from the people that hold these positions of power, and that's even more unsettling. Gary, perhaps you can answer the question, the bigger question, as to who or what controls the general U.S. posture towards Israel, based on your experience, and then something that you could illuminate also, which is leading up to the W. Bush presidency, but that you wrote about in your book. Your excellent book, Israel, Winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War. You wrote about Iran and the sort of covert relationship oil-wise between Iran and Israel. So maybe you could elaborate on that. But first, your take on who is in the driver's seat when it comes to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and thanks for including me with Professor Wilkerson. I learn so much from Larry every time I sit and listen to him on podcasts. He's my favorite guest on podcasts these days. I think if you look at Israel, from what I could see in back in my time, it certainly looked like the Israelis were driving our policies in the Middle East. In fact, I was told that by more than one person at the State Department. But if you look at energy energy security with Israel throughout their history, from the 1950s until 1994, they were dependent on Iran. Iran supplied them with more than 90% of their energy, and from the 1950s until 1979 during the revolution. They did it by sending ships over to starting in 1970. There was the top secret pipeline that was installed, and that was a joint venture pipeline between Iran, the Shah, and Israel. And it runs from Eilat, Israel, up to Ashkelon to take oil to bypass the Arab-controlled Suez Canal and the Sumet pipeline. So the Iranians wanted to bypass those two avenues. So they struck a deal with the Israelis to build this top-secret pipeline from Eilat to Ashkelon. And I learned all this. I was an oil guy for 21 years. I didn't know, and I worked in Saudi Arabia for a number of years. I learned all this from the authorized biography of Mark Rich. Mark was an international oil trader, multi-billionaire, one of the billionaires that Larry was talking about earlier, for most of his life. And he was the key player in taking care of Israel's energy security from 1970 until 1994. Even after the 1979 revolution, oil was cut off for about a month, but Mark was able to get that flowing again. And it was a steady stream of oil that would flow over, go through the pipeline. Israel would take what they needed, which was normally about 100,000 barrels. But it was most of it was sent off to Mark Rich's customers in Italy or Greece or Spain in the Mediterranean area, and so that was the Israel's lifeline for energy, and certainly.
And let me just interject here because I don't want the significance of this to go unnoticed. If it is significant, I think that it is. This means that Israel became almost like a de facto oil producer because Iran was under U.S. sanction, as I understand it. They didn't have all the access to the markets that they would have otherwise, and so they had to smuggle oil to Israel, which allowed Israel to sell it and turn a profit on it. And Mark Rich, in particular, who was essentially a Mossad agent.
Well, you're right. He when Daniel Aman wrote the biography of Mark Rich, I contacted him and I said, what can you tell me that you didn't put in the book? And he sent me an email and he said the two things. He said, number one, I couldn't believe that the top secret pipeline was kept secret from the International Oil Company. It was right. I didn't know. I checked with guys who traded oil in the Middle East for a number of years. They didn't know that it existed. True statement. The other thing he said was Mark Rich, had the head of Mossad on his speed dial, and they spoke several times a week. And so you're right. You had this combination, Israel, Mark Rich, and of course, Mark Rich's lawyer during all this time was Scooter Libby. Yes. Scooter Libby, who was Dick Cheney's chief of staff when he was vice president. But Scooter was Mark Rich's lawyer who made sure they could keep this stuff as legal as in the gray area, because Mark Rich's company was located in Switzerland, and so they did a lot of things that certainly were illegal for U.S. from the U.S. standpoint. But for Switzerland, it was not against the laws of Switzerland. But anyway, things caught up to him. Mark Rich was he was prosecuted for income tax evasion, so he in the early 1980s, and that hurt his business or hurt his ability to conduct business, but he continued to do so. And then in 1994, he had gotten into some other commodities and lost a lot of money. So he had to sell out his Mark Rich AG oil trading business to the City of London financial groups, the Rothschilds, et cetera. And they brought in a new management team, and they renamed the company Glencore. And Glencore today still exists. They still do a lot of trading to get Israel their oil, in fact, Mark Rich, a lot of his oil trading business was done with people who were sanctioned by the U.S. In fact, every time we sanctioned a new country, they saw it as a new opportunity to make money, and so when you look at when I hear that we're sanctioning Russia today for their oil, I think, oh boy, that's a new customer for Glencore and Trafigura, the other son of Mark Rich AG. So it's I'm sure it's continuing today. Everything that I see there's just so much oil trading going on out there. If you look at where Israel gets their oil today, they're getting most of it, from what I understand, from Azerbaijan through their pipeline that goes through Turkey. They've kind of lost their sweetheart deal with the Iraqi Kurds a little over 2 years ago, because the Iraqi Kurds were exporting their oil to Ceyhan, the Turkish port Ceyhan, and from there, Glencore and Trafigura could buy the oil, ship it down to Israel, and Israel would get it at a huge discount, because the Kurds had to sell this oil at a discount, because Baghdad considered all that oil to be smuggled oil out of Iraq, and so there were a limited number of customers that could take that oil, Israel being probably the biggest. And so they had a glut of oil from 2013 until March of 2023. And at that point, yes, Israel was in the import-export business of oil in a big way.
And interestingly, I think you'd agree with this, Gary, they seem to always manage to get their oil at a discount.
Yeah, huge discounts. In fact, I remember explaining that to some folks that were doing work with the Kurdistan and saying, well, Gary, they tell me that they sell it at market. I said, well, the way that formula works is you start off with the market price of Brent, and then you deduct discounts from that. I said the amount of dollars discount off of Brent before people would be convinced to buy Kurdish oil was tremendous. But they believed that they were selling it at market just because they started with the Brent dated market Brent price.
Gary, do you know Peter Hensler? Does that name ring a bell with you?
That name's familiar, but no, I don't really know him.
Judge Napolitano introduced me to him, and I had lunch with him. I think what I heard, a Swiss citizen, German citizen, U.S. citizen, billionaire, a Russian by birth, and he had some real comments to make about Glencore and the previous company that Mark Rich ran that you referred to. And when I said some things to him that you had vouchsafed to me as well as others had, he was shaking his head and saying, no, you got that wrong. We didn't have enough time for me to pursue it, but he seemed to be more or less defending Mark Rich rather than accusing him of perfidy or, beneath the table activity or whatever. He did agree that his entire function really for a long period was Israel.
Yeah,
he did agree to that. And $4.5 million Scooter Libby made, something like that.
Yeah, there was one transaction in the early 1980s, in 1 year, where Scooter. I found it on the internet. It was about $4 million that he earned from Mark Rich and Mark's partner, Pincus Green. Between the two of them.
Wonder if that was on his financial disclosure form.
Well, if you look at when Mark Rich was pardoned by President Clinton on his last day in office, Clinton, he said the biggest reason why he pardoned Mark Rich was because Scooter Libby vouched for Mark Rich and wrote a letter requesting the pardon. And so when I read the biography, what I was concerned about was, okay, what was Mark Rich's role in 2002, 2003 in the lead up to the war? Because, certainly and there were some things happening in the background that I didn't know about, but now I wonder what was going on between Mark Rich, Doug Feith, Richard Pearl, to get the right people in the right positions back in 2002, 2003, before we went into Iraq.
Yeah.
And certainly the one that comes to mind is the guy that I worked with closely at the Pentagon was this guy, Mike Makowski, who is the current CEO of GINSA in DC. And I was told back in 2003, Larry, you may know better than me, but I was told by the people in the intelligence community that GINSA is nothing more than a front for Mossad in downtown DC.
I think that's accurate.
Yeah. In fact, that was reinforced when, after I wrote my first book, I got a threat. And so I hired a private investigator who traced the threat back to the same building where GINSA is housed in DC. And he told me, he said, hey, every group, every company that is resident in that same building, he said, is very highly suspect and all related. And I said, well, what are you doing with it? He says, well, he said, I used to work for the FBI, so they're hearing about it. So, everyone in that building apparently is somehow associated with the Israeli intelligence.
But telling the FBI is like telling a pig farmer that there's.
Well, there you go. If you tell people at the lower level in the FBI, they're not going to do anything. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a couple things to add here just to sort of, I think, emphasize what you're saying and elaborate on certain parts of it. You're saying now that the Azerbaijan oil is a big part of Israel's energy security these days, and Azerbaijan happens to be the origin point of the modern, the 1990s, what you could call the McJihad or Al Qaeda partnership. That was the very first place where we sent in some Western formation sent in people like Secord and Ed Dearborn, people that were veterans of Iran-Contra and Air America, and they set up this airline/oil company called Mega Oil with all capital letters. And they began also transporting like jihadis and weapons and heroin pipelines. And it became this sort of center of, and also they put in the Aliyev family into power. They effected a coup and essentially, and swung Azerbaijan basically away from a Russian/ex-Soviet camp and more to the Western camp. You had people like Armitage and Dick Cheney on the Azerbaijani Chamber of Commerce, really strange things. And that same mega group, or the same name, I don't know if it's the same group, but it happens to be the same thing, mega, like all capital letters, was part of a kind of Israeli influence or spy operation, or I don't even know what you call it, because it wasn't spies. It was people like the Bronfmans, the Crown family, Steven Spielberg, and they were super influential American Zionists. So I would wonder if it was the same group. And it's fascinating that the oil today is relevant still, and it's still important as a kind of U.S.-Israeli proxy in the region, sowing chaos, getting in fights with Armenia, and so on. The other part of it is, and I think I mentioned this to you before, but it's still amazing to me, whenever I looked into your allegations or your explanation of the Kurdish oil that was being smuggled to Israel, basically, the American company that was doing business over there, the one big American company, and it might have been in your book, and I looked more into it, it was run by, the head of it was Ross Perot Jr., which, of course, makes me, I already had suspicions when I found that. I wondered, like, was Perot some sort of Israeli asset? Because why did he run? Why did he spend all of that money? How did George H.W. Bush lose when, if you're a political scientist and you look at an incumbent who had presided over the end of the Cold War and the Gulf War, he should have won in 92. Not that I'm a fan of the person, but he should have won. Perot is one of those strange things, and I find it too much of a coincidence that his son would get this very nice oil concession and very shady sort of smuggler type oil, concession. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, yeah, when the Kurds opened up their area for oil developed, there were a lot of companies that initially went. A lot of Western companies went in initially. I think Hunt was involved. Even ExxonMobil went in and signed some deals with the Kurds initially, but most of them left. And you're right. It's the Ross Perot company that is still there, still operating, but and I'm pretty sure they're the last American company still there. Most of the rest of the companies are European companies, and some of those are bailing as well, because the biggest problem that the Kurds are having is how to physically export their oil once it's produced. And so a lot of the Western oil companies aren't making any money, and so they bail. But the last I heard, the pros are still up there, and yes, we've had this discussion. It seems like from my specific history, I know that the guy that I worked closely with back in 2003 was a close personal friend of the Bush and Barbara Bush, and name was Phil Carroll. Phil was the retired CEO of Shell US, and Phil he said more than once that the Bushes blamed the Israel lobby for them failing to win the second term, and I think if you look at the statistics on the Jewish vote in America, between his first election and the second election, it fell significantly. So what Phil was telling me back in 2003 certainly rings true today. It appears that was the case, and you're right. It seems like there was Ross Perot had some strong support from the Israeli crowd.
Another thing that happened during that time period, which was there were a lot of scandals and things related to the October surprise and Iran-Contra that were still in the air when Bush was running in 1992. He had to pardon those guys at the end, which was a dubious thing, to pardon Weinberger and Poindexter, I believe. Some people considered that obstruction of justice related to Iran-Contra, but which I would think is on point when you look at it. But when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, those things don't get prosecuted anyway. So it's interesting to think, why were they going after Bush this way? But a clue to this might be the main person behind exposing BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which was like the CIA's very shady, drug-corrupted bank that did sort of like what Castle Bank used to do and so on, a very shady CIA-connected entity. The person who exposed that, and this was connected to Bush and people around Bush, the bank was, because he was head of the CIA. It was reported that he had an account at BCCI, I think, in the French press. But the person that exposed BCCI and really led to its dissolution was Morgenthau. And Morgenthau's family was one of the main people responsible for Israel being able to get the bomb and acquire the materials to get the bomb. And the Morgenthau family helped to finance this effort. And so there they are. There is this district attorney or federal attorney in New York going after a company that leads back to Bush and so on. It's very embarrassing for him. And I feel like this was it's not just the Jewish vote. It's a matter of people in positions of power using, and in the media, using whatever levers they could. And to me, the BCCI stuff, or the fact that Congress was so aggressively investigating things like October surprise, Lee Hamilton was looking into that at the time. It seems like everything was lining up against H.W. Bush in this way.
A lot of people forget, Aaron, that since as a 17-year-old, I think, he was extracted from the Pacific Ocean in World War II, H.W. Bush was associated with the CIA. You can trace it throughout his career. I've done so. He weaves himself in and out of that intelligence community, and by implication, other intelligence communities, the most formidable of which, often more so than the company, the CIA, are Mossad and MI6 in Britain. Britain, Aaron, lives its empire vicariously through us. Britain thinks it still is an empire, and its intelligence services particularly think that, but it lives its empire through us. If you're familiar with the book, The Tailor of Panama by John le Carré, you understand what I'm talking about. There's a scene in that book where the new guy is coming into MI6. He's been through all the training. He's a top agent. He's getting his first posting, and the guy who's briefing him is an old hand, think George Smiley type. And he says, "You're going to Panama." And the guy says, "Good God, I know I speak Spanish, but Panama? I'm going to Panama? My first assignment?" And the guy says, hold on. You don't understand. The Americans have left. Those stupid Yankees, they have left. We must correct them. You are going down there to foment the events in Panama that will force them to come back. You couldn't get a better description of how Britain still plays in the game, and it plays through us. And this happens all the time. Well, Bush is associated as vice president with every nefarious thing that Bill Casey and Bob Gates dreamed up to do. Everything. So he's got his fingers in not only everything that's transpired before he became vice president, 8 years of being Ronald Reagan's vice president, where Reagan said, "Don't tell me anything, just do it." So Bush has got all kinds of things associated with him that he knows about, and some of them are quite nefarious. And when he comes to the presidency, he's utterly opposed to most of what Reagan was doing, both domestically and internationally. And he's got, finally, the opportunity to discard all of that, he thinks, and to be president and to do what he wants to do. And he starts out that way. Remember those? No one remembers these speeches. When the Iraq invasion took place, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Bush goes to the United Nations. And he then gives a speech about the New World Order. And he talks about how this is what he wants. This is the way it should be. The United Nations should be used to do things when people transgress. And that was the original purpose. Let's do it. He talks about the New World Order that means. And he gets 625,000 troops together. Syrians, French, Saudis, Egyptians. And he goes and he kicks Saddam's army out of Kuwait. And people say, why didn't he go further? He didn't go further because the UN mandate did not tell him to go further. I mean, this was a guy who was, however you might think he was guilty before, or however he might have been inept at times when he did get the presidency, read my lips, no new taxes. Nonetheless, he was trying to capitalize on the end of the Cold War with a more positive world. I'm convinced of that. And Powell convinced me of that. And Bush convinced Powell of that. And Baker convinced us of that. And Brent Scowcroft convinced us of that. And Dick Cheney, God forbid, convinced us of that. Now, Dick Cheney did a lot.
He did disagree with him, though, publicly. Cheney did on the supposed Chicken Kiev. They called it the Chicken Kiev speech. And Bush, well, H.W. Bush had a more conciliatory position towards the Soviet Union, and he was saying that it was best not to use ethnic divisions to try.
Yeah, this was Gates. Gates and Cheney were together on that. Gates made sure he called Powell several times and told him he was wrong. He was dead wrong. In the last phone call they had, Powell said, I was in St. Catherine's Palace. I was sitting across from Gorbachev. I was on Long Island. I know what happened. The Cold War's over, Bob. Get used to it. And Gates kept fighting Powell the whole time. But I mean, it just defied everything that he had lied to Ronald Reagan about to get his first buildup in the first Reagan administration. Casey and Gates denied the bowels of the CIA. It's really expert Sovietologists. They were saying the Soviet Union would collapse within 8 to 10 years, which it, of course, did. That wouldn't have supported Ronald Reagan's massive buildup in the first administration, the largest expenditure for defense since World War II. Casey and Gates built the intelligence to go behind that, and the intelligence was utterly false.
And I want to get into the 21st century and ask Gary about W. Bush, but before I do that, Larry, could you explain how, after H.W. Bush loses, Bill Clinton turns policy sort of beneath the surface in many ways, away from H.W. Bush's, initiatives to sort of, not expand NATO, not make Israel this aggressive force in the Middle East. I mean, explain the Clinton years, because these seem so different now in retrospect than they did at the time. When you look at the geopolitical importance, it seemed like because the Cold War was over, geopolitics wasn't so important, but he did so many things that have come back to hurt us in the present.
The first year of the Clinton administration, which I was up close and personal to because Powell was still chairman all the way up to December of '94. Up to the end of that year, the Somalia occurred. I guess that would have been '93, December '93. It was absolute chaos. It was the most inept administration that either of us had ever seen take the reins of power in the United States in any way, fashion, or form. And of course, Powell had seen quite a bit. Don't ask, don't tell was a perfect example. The president told Powell to implement it, implement gays serving openly. And Powell said, okay, Mr. President, 3 bags full. Came back, got on the phone with Sam Nunn, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and let him know what had happened. His responsibility is twofold. Every 4-star's responsibility is twofold, the Congress and the president. So he was filling in the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee as to what had just transpired. Nunn said, over my dead body, and made a quick call to the president, the new president. And Powell then gets a phone call from Clinton, and Clinton says, please get me out of this. And don't ask, don't tell, 6 months later was the solution to that. But it was chaos, utter chaos. They didn't know what they were doing. Factor that into, over the next 3 years, he gets really, really concerned that the guy who's going to beat his ass for a second term is Colin Powell. And Powell was nursing that the whole time. It wasn't until November 95 at the Ramada Inn in Alexandria, Virginia, that Powell held a press conference and said he wasn't going to run. Shake that one off. What was Clinton trying to do during that time with regard to his national security bona fides, of which he had 0? This was the guy who got out of his ROTC contract through basically criminal activity. How did he build up his bona fides? Well, he started getting into national security issues, one of which was, let's convene these contractors and let's see what they say about expanding NATO, which was diametrically opposed to what Powell, Shalakashvili, Bill Perry, all of them had said they were going to do. Perry quits over this, Defense Secretary Bill Perry. The contractors come back and say, yes, wonderful idea, kind of like Cheney's idea of Halliburton studying outsourcing DOD, and then Cheney goes become CEO of Halliburton. I mean, incestuous relationships here all. But Clinton's was just disastrous, in my view, because it changed everything. Perry had just come back from Moscow. He entertains for 2 hours. It was only scheduled for 1 hour. My Marine Corps War College seminar in his office. We're sitting there for 2 hours listening to Bill Perry talk about his excitement. And, getting an engineer excited is hard to do sometimes, about the relationship, the Russian-U.S. relationship. He's just come back from talking to his counterpart in Moscow, others, and he's really high that we're going to do what H.W. Bush started out, and that is have a better relationship with Moscow that would include NATO membership. All of a sudden, it goes to hell in a handbag, and it's all because of Clinton. And every president from that moment on has deepened and made more profound that situation, including Obama.
Right. And Obama's a very fascinating case. When he was running in 2008, there were some questions among the Israel lobby and prominent Zionists about Obama and whether he was somebody they could really rely on. And the person who ends up diffusing that is Lester Crown. Obama relied on Lester Crown to vouch for him and say, no, this guy is good, he's reliable, because Obama has those Chicago ties, he's close to Rahm Emanuel. And so I think Obama kind of, in his own way, he had already the sanction of the kind of the older Brzezinskiite Rockefeller side of the U.S. establishment, and then also the Crown family, which is Zionism, and it connected to the mob in Chicago, and initially, like a lot of these influential, Zionist figures are, like Bronfman and Adelson. They're all connected to gambling in the underworld in different ways. It's amazing that we tolerate this. So, as you say, every person after this, it becomes is in one way or another has to very much satisfy, among other sources of power, the Israel lobby and the Zionists in the U.S. Now, Gary, maybe this would be a good time for you to talk about what happens after Bill Clinton, which is George W. Bush, and when you went to Iraq and were serving around the oil ministry and dealing with oil affairs there for the occupation, and especially the experience with Douglas Feith and Haifa, because just to preface this, in 1996, Scooter Libby, I believe, was one of the people who was a part of this report, but the clean break report that Benjamin Netanyahu commissioned, it called for making Israel so powerful that it could transcend all of its neighbors. You would abandon the peace process, and Israel should become self-sufficient economically, which to my mind, you wonder what that means. How would they possibly be able to do this? But I think what you're saying about Haifa and what you've written about this really helps to explain this. So with that as a preface, and what Israel and the Zionists were hoping for at the end of the 20th century, you find yourself in this oil misadventure in Iraq that shows that the war was about oil, but not the way people think it is. So can you explain this for us? It's really fascinating to me what you experienced.
Yeah. I did 5 months of pre-war oil planning at the Pentagon under Doug Feith's organization. And I studied the oil infrastructure of Iraq that entire time. I knew everything. I knew every pipeline. I knew every facility where oil was produced, where they refined it, et cetera. And then, and we had accomplished so much in our first couple of months in Baghdad. But anyway, we during all that time, there was no discussion of a Haifa pipeline. No discussion whatsoever. The only pipeline that got much discussion was the pipeline through Syria that exported oil out of Banias, Syria. And that discussion was primarily with this guy Mikowski and then Wolfowitz. They wanted it destroyed. And I would come to learn years later that the reason why they wanted it destroyed was because after the original Haifa pipeline that was constructed in 1934 and was shut down in 1948 when Israel came into existence, that the pipeline through Syria took their place. And so Wolfowitz wanted that pipeline destroyed. And we talk about the power of the lobby, but if you look at Paul Wolfowitz, everyone had agreed that there would be no oil infrastructure intentionally damaged during the war fighting. And that was the policy signed off by the principals, which was essentially the president's cabinet. But then you had Paul Wolfowitz at the last minute just kind of overrule everyone and come in and say, no, we're going to destroy this pipeline. Now, why did he feel like he had the authority to do that? And from what I could see, it's his authority came primarily from AIPAC and the lobby, and no place else. But anyway, we get into Baghdad, and I was in the office late in the day, and I get this telephone call from this guy Mikowski, and he introduces this pipeline, and the deception was from the beginning. He said, Gary, I need to know the status of the Kirkuk to Haifa pipeline. And I said, well, I know where Kirkuk is. Where is this place Haifa? And come to learn that's an old Hebrew pronunciation of the city of Haifa. And so he was trying to deceive me, and he succeeded because I had no clue. He said it was out the west towards Syria, and I said, well, okay. So I went to the oil ministry, and I asked the guy who was the oil minister at the time. I said, hey, can you give me the status? And he said, Gary, you don't want me to ask that question of my organization. And I said, okay, I'm game. Why shouldn't you be asking that? Or he said, there are a lot of Iraqis in this country, and certainly a lot of people in the oil ministry who feel like the primary reason why the U.S. came into Iraq was to take our oil and send it to Israel. And he said, sending it on a pipeline to Haifa would do that. I said, oh, shoot. At that point, I realized that this question was a lot bigger questions than I thought it was initially. So I went back. And Mikowski called me late in the day. He said, Gary, what's the status? I said, Mike, you misled me. I said, can you put what you need in writing? Tell me what it is you need, why you need it, and I'll sit down with Ambassador Bremer. And at that point, I heard clang on the other end of the line. He hung up on me. Well, Mike, he got a hold of the oil minister's telephone number, his cell phone that we had issued to the oil minister, and he phoned him. Apparently a week or two later to get the status. Well, it was after that all hell broke loose. The Iraqis started attacking their own pipelines in Baghdad. We had no idea why they were attacking their own pipelines back in 2003. But they essentially brought the country to a standstill. There was a shortage of gasoline and diesel. Gas lines in Baghdad in the middle of the summertime were a couple miles long, and most of the time they couldn't get gasoline because there was such a shortage. And certainly the attacks on the U.S. soldiers increased because of we were losing the control of the population at that point. But anyway, I learned 2 years later when one of the senior oil guys, Iraqis, was in D.C. at a meeting, and he admitted that the reason why they were attacking the Iraqis inside the oil ministry were attacking their own pipeline was because the Arabic papers in Baghdad were reporting from their international sources, i.e. Haaretz in Israel, that the U.S. was going to reopen the old pipeline to Haifa and pump Iraqi oil to Haifa, and so that's when things. People ask me, when did the insurgency start, and I say, well, heck, it was the third or fourth week in July 2003 when they started attacking the pipelines, because that's when really hell was set loose. That summer, because of the long gas lines, I can remember we had a VTC with a guy by the name of Miller on the NSC, and he was livid. He said, "Why is it that he said when I open the New York Times and the Washington Post, all the pictures have these gas lines of several miles long?" He said, "It looks like we're losing control over Iraq. What's going on?" And no one I didn't have an answer for him, and no one in the military had an answer for him. We didn't know why the Iraqis were attacking their own pipelines. Well, it became clear, the reopening the pipeline to Haifa was Plan A with the Israel lobby and certainly the government of Israel, and I would learn that eventually. But Plan B, since they knew they couldn't reopen that pipeline, the Iraqis wouldn't allow them, then they decided to order the oil ministry to sell oil to Glencore, and so the oil ministry started piping northern production out of the north through the pipeline to Ceyhan, and at that point they were selling it to Glencore, the company that had supplied 90% of Israel's oil for the previous decades. And then we noticed that the northern pipeline started being attacked. And we didn't know back in 2003, starting in October of 2003, the insurgents started attacking the northern pipelines. And we didn't know then why they were attacking them, but they continued until I took a break in the summer 2004. But every time we had that pipeline open to Ceyhan, the insurgents would shut it down again with an attack. But we learned that, it was the fact that there was this customer of the oil ministry called Glencore that was picking up oil in Ceyhan and delivering it to the ports in Israel. And so that continued for years after that until 2013 when the Kurds opened up their pipeline to Ceyhan and started delivering Kurdish oil, the highly discounted Kurdish oil from that was produced up in Kurdistan, delivered that to Ceyhan, and that was delivered to Israel as we spoke earlier. But that was, people ask me, why did we get into that war? I think Larry knows best, but from my limited exposure, it was to get energy security for Israel. And the original plan was to reopen this old pipeline to Haifa. It was the first export pipeline out of Iraq built in 1934. But the everything I read in Haaretz when I did my first book that was written in Haaretz in 2003 indicated that they were counting on that pipeline to be reopened And then even Netanyahu, who was the Minister of Finance, went to London, to the city of London in June of 2003, looking for financing to expand that pipeline to 1 million barrels a day. So he was asking for a couple $2 billion. I don't know who he was going to get to build it. Maybe he thought that KBR would do it, or someone that was a contractor that was out there. They probably would have for a couple $1 billion. But it became apparent in the summer of 2003 that the Iraqis in the Ministry of Oil would not tolerate reopening that pipeline to Haifa.
Yeah, that is just amazing to me, and especially thinking back on how none of this was reported at all and not understood at all. But when you explain it that way, then suddenly the insurgents go from a Western caricature of fanatical Muslim terrorists to people who are actually understood how and why they were under attack from the empire. It makes the whole thing seem, I mean, it's so different from what we were told at the time. They were resisting democracy. They were part of the, Al-Qaeda war on terror we had to defeat, and that's why we had to defeat them, so we didn't have to defeat them in the U.S. Totally nonsensical. And let me, if I could add one more thing. In my previous research, have looked at the drug trade as well, okay? And the drug trade seems to be consolidated in the U.S., controlled by the Lansky Syndicate and the Teamsters at the time, protected by the FBI and Hoover and the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and also James Angleton in counterintelligence protected this. And it's been more or less preserved in different ways over decades. And I surmise that after H.W. Bush lost and BCCI receded, this more Israeli-connected firm, and I base this on Peter Dale Scott's research, called Far West, sort of became the sort of intelligence, one of the intelligence entities in charge of dealing with the drug trade. And when I think about how Israel wanted to become self-sufficient, and the Lansky, Mossad connections in the past, and the fact that Israel probably has been one of the beneficiaries of the global drug trade, or Zionist actors, it makes me also wonder if Afghanistan, and part of the reason for the occupation was that if everything had worked out as they had planned, Afghanistan would be increasing the wealth of Israeli Zionist entities because of their monopoly on opium, and Iraqi oil would be making Israel, rich in oil and rich in dollars. It all seems to kind of make more sense, but it's so dark that you don't even want to think that they could have been thinking that way. But another
aspect of it, Aaron, that is minor compared to what you were detailing there, but maybe not in the long run of things, is this is what made Netanyahu. This is what gave him the bona fides as finance minister, and people knowing just by the fact that they were experiencing this constant economic rise rather than stasis or fall, that he was responsible for it. This is what got him into the political process to be a prime minister. It is also what got him the backing to get Yitzhak Rabin murdered and to eliminate the Labor Party for all practical purposes forever in Israel, and to be a tyrant. This is what convinced the Israeli people the economic success that Netanyahu brought them to keep him around for freaking ever.
Yeah. And Aaron, to get back to your point about how it was kept secret from the American people in the press, I got to know the press in Baghdad, several of them, because the PAO, the public affairs folks, asked me to talk to the press and convince them there was no oil agenda. And I did. I told them there was no oil agenda between what we were doing and the major international oil companies, because the press was reporting that it was about Bush and Cheney taking care of their Exxon Mobil and Chevron and whatnot. And I said, hey, there is none. I said, I didn't see that at all. And so when I discovered in 2015 what I discovered, I reached out to the guy who was the oil reporter for the Wall Street Journal, who is currently well, last I checked, he was the bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal in London. And he was a good guy. He had Yale graduate, spent time in the Navy, and I got to know him quite well. And so I reached out to him, and I said, why didn't you see this? Why didn't you pick up on this? And he said, Gary, I was out there every day working like you were. I didn't have time to listen to this. And I said, well, you had a base support back in New York. Are you telling me that no one back there was reading Haaretz? Because it was being reported in Haaretz almost daily about this. And he refused to answer that. I guess he didn't want to get in trouble with his people back in D.C. But you're right. It was kept out of the mainstream media, except for Haaretz. Haaretz was reporting it, and then I saw there are a couple articles in the Guardian that talked a little bit about the Haifa pipeline, but that was it. And yeah, I certainly didn't know about it. Actually the first time that I even started thinking about it, I was interviewed by Steve Cole, who's the current dean of journalism at Columbia.
The guy that wrote Ghost Wars, among other things.
Yes,
and director this.
And he was writing a book on ExxonMobil, and he reached out to me because he thought he'd be able to come and interview me and get some connection between ExxonMobil and Iraq. And he showed up here at the house, and we sat in the kitchen for a couple hours. And one of the first questions he asked me, knowing that I would probably deny, he said, Gary, was there anything different? Anything, what was the word he used? Anyway, was there something unusual that happened the first couple of days? And I said, well, yeah, the Haifa pipeline. He said, what the hell's the Haifa pipeline? And so I walked through the story with him, explaining how Makowski had contacted me. Well, Steve obviously felt like there was something to that story. So chapter 11 in that book is entitled The Haifa Pipeline. And in fact, he went back and talked to Makowski and to get his input on what happened with that exchange. And Mike, the only thing Mike said was that, well, that request came from the Israelis. Well, as Larry and I have learned through our contact, Dennis Fritz, apparently the Israelis were in Doug Feith's office almost daily, the Mossad visiting Feith during those times. And so it sounds legit that these Israelis that were visiting Feith almost daily and spending hours that were inquiring about the status of the Haifa pipeline. And so they gave the mission to this guy Makowski to contact me. But yeah, it was kept secret. They did a great job of keeping it they kept it from me.
Yeah, it was never brought up in the 2004 presidential debates about what was going on in Iraq and how we should respond. It was this, we were having a conversation about a war that we weren't even allowed to understand what the conflict was about, at least as far as the insurgency was concerned, or about why we were there in the first place. But I guess that brings me to Larry here, because of course he had a very interesting and important position in all this, and a perspective that's really unique here. Your experiences as Powell's chief of staff under W. Bush, and what you can say now in retrospect about the influences, especially the Zionist influence, on decision making during those years.
Well, it was extraordinary. If you want to look at the basic things that happened, the most unbelievable of which was when Bush met with Sharon, Netanyahu's intermediate prime minister, and essentially told him that the Middle East peace process was defunct, that there wouldn't be two states, that it had failed for 45, 50 years. And Powell, of course, is getting this as he's getting ready to go, I think at the time, to Ramallah and meet with Arafat, and trying his best to resurrect what was a dead animal, the Middle East peace process, the roadmap, all the euphemism we use to describe it. And Bush tells Sharon in the Oval Office, it's over to you. Everything's failed. Nothing has worked. You have carte blanche now. You can do whatever you want to. that was a moment of epiphany for Powell, I think. And even though he continues to try to do something to resurrect the process, every time he goes out on a limb to do it, Cheney's with a big saw. Hell, he's got a chainsaw back there, cutting the limb off. The last meeting, I think, with Arafat was in Ramallah, and it was a meeting of tears, of grief, of, hand-wringing. Nothing. There's nothing we can do. This president's given up on you, given up on the peace process, given up on the two-state solution. And that began what we're seeing right now. It began Netanyahu's clear road to victory for greater Israel.
Right, because this seems to be under Obama, he doesn't part with this. As I said, he was given Lester Crown's, seal of approval, and he launches these Arab Spring wars, which seem more the Arab Spring now. When you look back on it and you think about Twitter and Facebook and Google, these seem like American-generated color revolutions of a sense. And the only real substantive outcome of them, it's not like they really change anything in Egypt or Tunisia, except you get new stooges in there. But you get these two long-desired wars that the neocons wanted in regime change operations in Libya and Syria. And in Syria, it culminates in the most absurd outcome, which is al-Qaeda in charge there. So did Obama...
It isn't over, Aaron. It isn't over. Trita Parsi's right. We're going to have another war before Christmas.
I always am hesitant about predictions like that, but it does seem like they can't coexist, but they also can't fight the war with Iran. That seems to be so typical of everything. They can't proceed in the same way, the U.S. or Israel, in so many different parts of the world, and yet they can't reverse course for different reasons.
Netanyahu thinks that he has a grip, and the grip is infallible, and that the United States, especially with Trump, will have to come into the war. And I think he thinks that air power via the United States is all that's going to be necessary. That's poppycock. That's not. 90 million people, 51% of whom are Persians, a vast territory, 4, 5, maybe 6 times bigger than Iraq. That's the end of the empire, and it's certainly the end of the state of Israel. Not only that, Iran has demonstrated, I think, conclusively that the 12-day beautiful war was anything but beautiful for Israel. And they didn't unleash 10% of what they are capable of unleashing. And I also think, and this is my gravest concern for that region, I think the Iranians now, and I met with Rouhani, I met with Ahmadinejad, I met with Salehi. They were not building a nuclear weapon. They are now. And I think they're very close. I think they might even have one by the time this war starts. That's a real change, because Israel's got nuclear weapons too. So what are we going to do? We're going to come to an existential state for Israel. The United States is not about to put troops on the ground in Iran, because if it did, it would be the end of the empire. And what do? We shoot nukes at one another. One nuke would take care of Israel. And Netanyahu knows that. So does he preempt? This is a dangerous game they're playing now, and it's outside the confines of what we've constructed for Israel to do for us in the Levant. Completely outside it. And we've got a clown in charge of the country.
Gary, do you have any insight on the Obama years and what his continuation of the Bush policies, or any pushback or anything that would be mitigating when you think about the Obama years, or
the JCPOA? I mean, that's the only diplomatic achievement the empire has accomplished since the end of the Cold War.
Larry's right. The JCPOA, the people in the Middle East that I certainly not the State Department and the military, U.S. military, but the civilian people, the people that weren't associated with the government, thought that the JCPOA would work. It was a way forward, a peaceful way forward. In fact, the oil industry was welcoming it. And so, yeah, we were disappointed that when Trump abolished it a few years ago.
I think Dick Cheney would ultimately, if Dick Cheney were back to being the Dick Cheney when he was Secretary of Defense and wasn't on all those statins that made him paranoid and such, if Dick Cheney were that person, heinous, cold-hearted dude that he was most of the time, Dick Cheney would say, yeah, Halliburton would love to work with Iran.
Right. That seems to be the motivation of the Cheney crowd, which it was, they would have liked to have all those oil reconstruction contracts in Iraq and wherever else that the whole neoconservative project would go into other countries and so on. But it didn't quite, they wouldn't have been able to do that themselves. They weren't powerful enough themselves. To me, it seems like a lot of the things that have happened in the U.S. empire that involve these intrusions into democratic politics. I think the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, Iran-Contra, they may be understood by reference to Zionists who always were obsessed with this greater Israel issue, the fact that they control the underworld, which means they control the blackmail operations and everything else that the underworld needs to corrupt politics, and they have enormous amounts of money. I mean, to change the structure, I think, of the U.S. corporate class since the end of World War II, the drug money that went through Las Vegas and was laundered there has changed the U.S. economy and the makeup of the 1%, best I can tell. And if I'm right,
it's not just the drug money, as Misha Glenny pointed out many years ago in McMafia, and it's much worse now. It's also trafficking in people, especially young girls and young boys, and it's also now and aided and abetted majorly by what's happening in Gaza and on the West Bank, organ traffic. And it's also, oddly enough, I mean, illicit drugs are in there too, as you said, but it's also, oddly enough, automobile theft. It's number 4 or number 5 in the world now. You can check your car in Montenegro to a valet at a reputable hotel, and the next morning your Mercedes is on a boat to Italy and then on a boat to North Africa. Right.
They corrupt politics locally and regionally and nationally in so many ways, and they're able to do it because they have the fix. And I think, which is generally connected to national security officials in one way or another, or other elites, political elites. They're allowed to operate this way.
It has to be protected the way it is. I mean, CIA, Mossad, MI6, they got their hands deeply in all of it for whatever reasons. I think they're deeply in Ukraine right now as a triumvirate. And they're bleeding both sides. They're bleeding the Russians and the Ukrainians, and to a certain extent, the Europeans.
I think I will close with this question. I'll give it first to Gary, and then to Larry. Gary, given this history, and of course you're not Nostradamus or you don't have divine vision more than anybody else, but where do you see this? It's coming to a head now in a dramatic, spectacular, horrific way. Where do you see our perspective on these questions in 10 years? What is going to happen in the coming years here regarding Israel, the U.S. empire, the Middle East, and so on?
That's why I watch Larry all the time. I'm hoping I can get a hint, because it's a huge question. A year ago, I was concerned that we weren't going to see this year. I thought we were so headed towards what I thought was a nuclear war. And I think, okay, well, at least under Trump, maybe we could avoid a nuclear war. But where are we going? I agree with you on that question. It's unknown. From an oil standpoint, an energy standpoint, I should say, unfortunately, we are tied to oil or hydrocarbons for the foreseeable future. The guys in the oil industry that I still associate feel like, hey, long term, we've got to go nuclear to stay to get clean energy to this country. But yeah, where are we going to be in 10 years? Good question. I don't have any answers, and I look for Larry all the time to give me hints. I think we got to have lunch again sometime, Larry. You and Dennis and I need to get together for lunch.
Yeah, well, Valerie was asking me about that the other day. We need to get all of us together.
Yeah, she needs to come back too. Yeah, we do.
Well, Larry, the same question for you. In 10 years, in 5 years, what's really the horizon of this thing, and how do you see it shaking out? Because I can see all sorts of scenarios ranging from doomsday to peace breaking out, but just because, whether through war or whether because of somebody stepping back from the abyss when defeat is guaranteed. But what predictions do you have at this point?
Well, let me look at the limited bright side that I think is out there. I think in Alaska, and perhaps in subsequent phone calls or discussions, Trump and Putin have decided that they really do need to do something about New START, which goes out in February of 26 and is the last vestige of nuclear weapons arms control. If they're being honest, and it's hard to say that about Trump, but he has mentioned Xi Jinping in a positive way, bringing him in, because the Chinese are going to build out until they can match the U.S. and Russia in terms of total nuclear warheads and capacity to deliver them. That's an extremely dangerous world again, with no treaties at all. And they've talked, I understand from sources, they've talked about the most dangerous elimination of all, the INF Treaty, because those are the most dangerous weapons. Those are the ones most apt to be used. And Russia it's in our interest to do that, because Russia has stolen a march on us in terms of developing these missiles so that they have a new generation, basically the Oreshnik-like hypervelocity missiles. We're working furiously with this new $2 trillion plus dedicated to nuclear weapons modernization, securitization, and all the other things we say. Really what we're doing is we're developing a first strike capability. That worries me to death. The first strike capability is most focused with the Sentinel new ballistic missile, which has, as I understand it, a single contractor behind it. I'm sure there are others associated, but and this is an effort that looks like it's going to go ahead. And this missile will give us, as I said, a first strike capability. We'll still take 100 million casualties in whatever retaliation results, but we will have so limited the retaliation capacity of the main nuclear powers, read China and Russia, that we can win. People are actually talking about this now, including scientists at Los Alamos and Sandia and JPL and other places like that. They're actually talking about technology, particularly AI, applied to this new type of warhead, MIRV warhead, that will allow us to reduce the circular error of probability, reduce the fratricide, and hit every Soviet, Russian, Chinese, whatever, silo with such precision that it's guaranteed destruction with only 1 or 2 missiles, whereas before it was 10 for every silo. So all of that to say, we're in a very dangerous world. And if Putin and Xi and Trump have agreed that they're going to go above this crap of Ukraine and the rest of the stuff, you know, terrible that it is, and deal with this, that's a positive thing, very positive thing. And their first move will be, I hope, to renew New START and to bring Xi Jinping into the treaty regime and then to work on the others. If we don't do that, we're headed, as Gary said, we're headed for nuclear war.
Yes, and this is, the fundamentals of it aren't that different from Dr. Strangelove in a sense. And the Russians have a dead hand. They actually have a doomsday machine, essentially. Pretty much, I won't say exactly like, but almost exactly like what gets described fictionally in Dr. Strangelove, the dead hand, they call it. And this would be a way to deter any attack like the kind you're describing. It would seem madness to pursue such a thing because they know they've already thought of this possibility.
Yep. I think they have enough intelligence to know what we're doing, as we have enough intelligence usually to know what they're doing. Although they stole a march on us, I think, with these hypervelocity missiles. What Putin did, what the complex in Russia did, was say, okay, the INF treaty's gone, but there's nothing prohibiting us for doing research and being ready to roll should something happen in that regime, because that is the most dangerous regime of nuclear weapons. And they were ready. They were ready. The moment Trump nullified that treaty, they put it in motion, and they now have pretty powerful missiles that we cannot stop. They're too fast. Too fast. I mean, these missiles are so fast, they go between points in minutes rather than a half hour.
Yeah. And the Russians, at this point, the U.S. does not have the element of surprise in any meaningful way, because I believe any U.S. adversaries now understand the U.S. is totally untrustworthy, is capable of anything. You look at what the U.S. did with Iran, sort of lulling them into some sense of security before Israel launches these assassinations. Or you look at Israel with the beepers and the pager attacks in Lebanon. You look at the Gaza genocide. You look at the Ukraine war, which, even though it can't be won, the U.S. sacrificed all these people to be slaughtered. Our adversaries know that, I don't say our, but the adversaries of the U.S. know that the U.S. is totally untrustworthy and capable of just about anything the Western Empire is. And so there's no sneak attack to be had, I don't think, in that sense. Like, they have to be preparing for the worst, which just means they're going to have a retaliation capacity, because for them it's existential. Yep. To me, it seems that peace should win out only because it seems to be the only way that people get to live.
Sadly, a reasonable characterization of where we are.
Well, and I hope, as you say, I hope that this is a sign of something that we can be optimistic about, that they're at least recognizing this, or that the U.S. is going to invite them to nuclear talks and then nuke them. Which, I mean, that sounds absurd, but it's almost in the realm of possibility.
You'd be surprised how many people I've talked to in the last week or two who look at it that way. How can anybody, Xi Jinping, Putin, the Ayatollah, how can anybody trust the word of the United States anymore?
Gary, do you have any last words? And also, can you tell people about your book and where to get it? Because we did some episodes on your book, and I really recommend it to people. It's really eye-opening. Larry, you need to get a book that week, so I can
email me, and I'll send you one free. I still have about a dozen left.
I keep Larry supplied. He gives them away. Here's the book. It's available on Amazon. Israel, winner of the 2003 Iraq oil war. It's out there along with my first book. This is the one that talks primarily about the oil agenda. The first book talks primarily about the U.S. forces' involvement in the oil sector and what they did to improve the oil sector of Iraq. But this is the book that talks primarily about the oil agenda to the Iraq war.
And Aaron, let me just add a kudo for Gary. If there is one positive thing about what we did in Iraq, it is that they now have a functioning oil ministry and a functioning system. And it could be even better if they were able to capitalize on everything that's available to them. I think they could probably, as Saudi Arabia comes down, Iraq could probably replace Saudi Arabia.
You're right, Larry. That is, I have a lot of pride in what we in the U.S. forces did, because we built that export facility, or we didn't build it. David Petraeus actually started and pushed that through the government. Got the government to spend $2 billion when it was very difficult for the government of Iraq to do that. To build that facility, and it's enabled them to export an additional 1 billion barrels a year, which is very lucrative for them. And so it's enabled them to be a world-class producer. In fact, next to the Saudis, they're the largest producer of oil in the Middle East today. Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you both so much for drawing upon your experience and contributing to this conversation today. I hope that people out there think it's timely and useful and as interesting as I do. So I salute you both. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Aaron. Good seeing you, Larry.
You too, Gary. We got to get together again.
Yeah, we do.
Before we go to the grave.
I agree.
Well, we might all be there the way things are.
I agree.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I want to express my deepest appreciation to all of our American Exception subscribers. If you are not a subscriber, please consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Thank you for tuning in and helping us bring light to the devil's chessboard.